Hello, everybody. My name is Yamam Masharqa. I'm a junior in high school living in Ramallah, Palestine. And today I will be talking about Anbara Khalidi, who was one of the first Arab feminists. My big question is, who was Anbara Khalidi and what were the events in her life that shaped her personality? But before that, I need to tell you that I'm not an expert, but I promise that I tried to learn as much as I could to satisfy my curiosity about this topic. Someone here might know more than me about this topic, so please correct me, ask questions, and contribute, but do it nicely. I'm not trying to persuade you of my agenda or convince you to take action. My only hope is that my presentation might cultivate your own curiosities. First, I will be talking about how Western feminism is not necessarily ideal for women of color, and I will specifically be talking about Arab women and Arab culture. Second, Anbara Khalidi's background, and third, what were the remarkable events in her life that shaped her? But before that, let me tell you about what led me to this. Here I attached a picture of the beautiful South African feminist called Elma Akub. Elma made a video where she talks about how Western feminism is not necessarily beneficial for women of color, especially because they come from different ethnic backgrounds and different cultures that might clash with Western beliefs and principles and Western feminism. And this applies on Arabic culture and Arabic women too. What makes Arab feminism different? Arab feminists advocate women's rights, gender equality, and social justice, just like Western feminism. But what makes it different is that it's grounded in an Arab and a Middle Eastern framework. And Anbara Khalidi was one of the first people to do that. Let me remind you of my big question again. Who was Anbara Khalidi? Let's talk about her family. Her father was Salim Ali Salam and her mother was Kulthum El Barber. Both of her parents came from noticeable and prestigious families in Beirut. She got married to Ahmed Al Khalidi, who was a Palestinian man that worked as the principal of the Arab College in Jerusalem. And it's worth mentioning that her dad really encouraged her to participate in social activities and express herself freely. Anbara Khalidi was born and raised in Beirut. She was born in 1897 and she passed away in Beirut in 1986. She received great education in Beirut, considering the fact that her mother came from a family of well-known educators. And the first type of education that she received was in the traditional kuttabs. Kuttabs is where students from the community gather together in a mosque to learn about the Arabic language and the Islamic religion. Anbara, she was kind of privileged considering the fact that she did receive a great education. So she wanted to help women in her community. She formed something called the Awakening of the Young Arab Women Association. This association was built to help finance the education of young women in her society because she thought that education is really important. And I attached a picture from her book where she talks about this association. Her book was called Memoirs of an Early Arab Feminist. She talks about a period of social reform and the birth of women's activism in the Arab world. And she, of course, applies her own stories when talking about this period of time. Actually, Anbara Khalidi was a translator. She was the first person to translate the Odyssey. The Odyssey was written by the Greek intellectual Homer. And she also translated the Aeneid, which was written by the Roman writer Virgil. In 1925, she went to England for a short trip with her father and three of her siblings. And she was surrounded by amazing British women that always told her about their intentions for joining the workforce. And that really inspired her. And she wanted to take that idea back with her to Beirut to empower other women. In the 1920s, intellectuals in the American University of Beirut wanted her to talk about this trip. So they called that lecture An Oriental Woman in England. And while stepping on the podium, Anbara Khalidi unveiled herself, becoming the first Muslim woman to unveil herself publicly in the Great Syrian region at that time period. And unfortunately, she received a lot of backlash because of this movement, especially because during that period of time, women in her society were expected to cover their heads. Like I said before, she got married to Ahmed al-Khalidi and they moved together to Jerusalem in 1925. She remained a feminist and she became an advocate of the Palestinian cause. And her husband was an educator and she wanted to help him in some way. And she wanted his voice to be heard by international communities. So she helped him to translate his works to English. And in the year of the Nakba in 1948, she was forced to leave Jerusalem with her family and she came back to Beirut. Tamam Salam, a relative of her, describes her as the person that carries rebellion in her heart. Anbara Khalidi was considered one of the first Arab feminists who tried to challenge the Arab retroactive traditions. She had a major role in building what is now called Arab or Middle Eastern feminism. And unfortunately, she didn't get recognized for all of the great work she did and the achievements she's done. She was an amazing woman that stood by what she believed in. Women are still fighting for their rights throughout the world, especially with now what's happening in Iran after the killing of Mahsa Amini. Anbara Khalidi, again, was one of the greatest women in the Middle East that tried to change the fate of feminism. And I hope that through this presentation, people get to know her better and get to know more about her achievements and great works. These are the references that I used. And for further reading, I would recommend reading her book, Memoirs of an Early Arab Feminist. And I would recommend watching Elma Akub's video where she talks about how Western feminism is not really beneficial for women of color. Thank you so much for listening to me.